Okay, thanks, Ankur, letting us know it is recording. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the GovCon Board Mission Critical webinar series. This second one is focused on the DavisBacon Act. My name is Archisha Meehan, and I am the executive for Fedmine. We are recording this session, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording and the slides. Little bit of housekeeping. You do have a Q&A chat box. Please use that to ask your questions. And this is a discussion, so please do keep asking questions. We all love that. So Leela, the next slide, please. So this is our agenda, just a quick introduction, and then we're going to get straight into the discussion itself. Next slide. So a little bit about Fedmine. We were founded in 2004, and we basically provide federal business intelligence to the government contracting community. We were founded in 2004. Just recently, for those who don't know, we have basically joined forces with GovSpend, which is GovSpend is the leader in the SLED industry, and they actually have the largest purchase orders in their database. So we are super excited to now be one of the top providers of both federal and SLED intelligence. Next slide. What we really do is integrate all these various data slides and data points into one easy to use platform. And actually, one of the ways that some of our clients will use our data is to see contracts that actually have the DavisBacon Act requirement. So I'm going to go into the next slide and introduce all our speakers. So my first speaker that I would love to introduce is Eric, who is a partner at Holland & Knight. He specializes in government contracts and internet technology law. He is an expert in his field, and we are very thrilled to have Eric as one of our speakers. So thanks, Eric, for being here. Jim Campbell is founder and CEO of Axe Inference Solutions Group. A veteran, Jim is committed to his clients and helps and make sure that they find the best solutions for their business. Thank you, Jim, for being here. Thank you, Jim, for your service. And lastly, our moderator, Pete, who has more than 30 years of experience serving small and large companies. He is the leader of SCNH's audit practice and the government contracting industry team leader. Again, all of our speakers and moderators are very committed to their clients and the businesses and very knowledgeable in government contracting, as you will find out in this session. So with that, I am going to hand it over to all of you.
Thank you, Archisha. Hi, this is Pete, as Archisha mentioned, and I do want to welcome everybody for attending. This is session 2 of a 3-part series of sessions where I'm moderating, and Jim and Eric are really the knowledge experts in these areas, providing their wealth of information, and they can provide. Last session was on SCA. Today is going to be on DBA DavisBacon Act. These sessions are being brought to you by the GovCon Board, which not only Fedmine, Axe, Holland & Knight, and SCNH Group are members of. But we also have the Capital Group that provides retirement services, investment services. We have our Public Capital Access Group, and Matt Stavish that does alternative financing for government contractors. Robert Ganji, RG Consulting Services, who has many years of banking expertise and helping government contractors succeed and grow. We have Edge Realty, Scott Mendelson, who helps provide commercial realty services, especially in the government contracting space. We have Human Resources Consultants LLC / Alan Luba, who I didn't forget this time, Alan, and of course Paylocity, Zach, the payroll service provider. So all different skill sets, but everyone has expertise in the government contracting space. And we're just really excited to continue to be providing these lecture series and hopefully in-person networking events sooner rather than later. So that's the list of the GovCon board, and we'll just go right into it. So let's just start off. Eric, I'm going to kick it over to you. Can you just go over the basics of DBA, DavisBacon Act compliance?
Sure, happy to. And welcome everybody. It's great to see you virtually, at least. Hopefully, like Pete said, we could do these in person soon. I'm actually in Anchorage, Alaska, at an in-person conference for the 8A organization, and it's nice. We had a nice event outside last night, so there's ways to do these things. So we'll figure that out and try to get some in-person events to you soon, because it's always good to see people in person. For DavisBacon Act, it's very similar in a lot of ways to the Service Contract Act. You talk about a lot of these two statutory regimes together because they are similar. We talked, as Pete said the last time, about Service Contract Act. DavisBacon Act has a very similar compliance requirement. You have wages and benefits according to a wage determination. You have notification requirements, and you have record keeping requirements. The wage determinations will map out what, if any, benefits are included. They'll map out wages. It's a little bit more complicated with the wage determinations for DavisBacon Act than Service Contract Act. I mean, Service Contract Act, you just have essentially a list of labor categories, and you have to fit somebody under those labor categories that are in a wage determination and map it to the Directory of Occupations. Here, you have something a little bit different, where you have a wage determination with occupations, but you also have different types of wage determinations depending on the construction project that's going on. So you'll want to kind of look to see what kind of construction project is going on, what kind of wage determination is most appropriate. But in the end, it's all the same, where the agency is the ones that's supposed to pick the wage determination. And they're supposed to understand and know which one is appropriate for you. And then you can then slot in the folks in there. So the biggest difference between SCA and DavisBacon Act, there are actually two big differences. The first one is that under the Service Contract Act, the government essentially says you pay the workers their wages and benefits that are required, and essentially you'll hear from us if there's a problem. With DavisBacon Act, you have an obligation to submit the wages weekly to ensure, and it must be signed and certified. In that way, the government can ensure that the proper wages are being provided. So that's a difference. People have to be paid weekly. The certified payroll has to be issued weekly, and it must be certified. And certified is a really important word, because certified triggers, essentially False Claims Act. So if you're certifying something and it's not true, and it's the general you, not anybody listening, then that can trigger a False Claims Act claim and investigation and all the parade of horribles that go along with that. So it's really a way to kind of keep the contractors in line and make sure that they're paying the right wages and benefits by submitting those certified payrolls on a weekly basis. That's the first big difference. There's no certified payroll requirement in SCA. Folks can be paid every other week on SCA, not the same for DavisBacon. The second big difference is, and we're going to talk a lot more about this kind of next go around when we have our next presentation on investigations, but is debarment. On Service Contract Act, debarment is kind of a strict liability standard where, essentially the government has a right to debar a contractor if they violate the Service Contract Act even one penny one time, the way the statute's written. And they wrote it that way because they figured, they said at the time that this is going to be so easy to comply with that the only people who are not going to comply with it are people who are purposefully not complying with it. So that's the standard under the Service Contract Act for debarment. Luckily, the government takes the position that takes a much more nuanced position on debarment, and only debars 10, 15 companies a year or so, where there are hundreds of investigations that have adverse findings a year. On the DavisBacon Act side, the bar is a little higher for debarment. There was maybe a recognition that this is not so easy to comply with, but you need something more than just the fact that you violated it, but your violation essentially has to be what's called like gross negligence, where you're essentially not purposefully, but recklessly not abiding by the DavisBacon Act by not paying attention to the requirements and things like that. So, there's some important differences, but the idea is the same behind both statutes, where they both require wages and benefits in accordance with the wage determination. And, it's that kind of whole system where the government issues these wage determinations, and that will determine what the wages and benefits that the folks who are on the contract receive. And it's the same challenges where, the mapping challenge, where you're trying to figure out, what labor category, what job description, what are folks doing, so it could be mapped properly. So that way you're not kind of falling out of line with what the workers are supposed to be paid, at least in DOL's eyes. That's my quick summary, Pete.
Thank you, Eric. Real quick, and I want to add, if people have questions, we like this to be an open forum. Please use the Q&A function, not chat, but the Q&A, so that we can track open, answered, and dismissed questions. But just forgot to mention that previously, so put that out there. One of the things, and I have clients who are government contractors, construction companies. So I've had to do audits and work with companies that have SCA and DBA, and those are great points, because definitely the mandatory reporting on the DBA side is important. You got to get it right. It's not a we'll check up on you when we check up on you kind of thing. And can you talk a little bit, like, with regards to who's required to get paid what? It's not so much the employee's title, but what they do, correct?
Yeah, and that's a great point, Pete. I think we make a mistake of thinking, all right, this is the title, this is what they get paid, without looking at what they're actually doing. DOL only cares about what their person's actually doing. You could call them the CEO of your company all you want, but they're not going to be exempt because you call them a CEO, and they're not going to get paid a certain rate because of that. If the person who you call a CEO is a laborer, they should be paid the benefits and pay in accordance with the laborer. So it's not, DOL is going to look at what they're actually doing. They're going to interview those employees to find out what they're doing. If there is a disagreement about that and there's an investigation, and you're going to pay the employees for that time that they're being interviewed. So it's really important to kind of get that right and understand what the folks are doing on the contract in order to make sure that they're slotted into the appropriate wage category, labor category.
Yeah, the way I've heard it is, if say the PM goes out and starts picking up a hammer or a nail gun and starts doing the actual framing, then he's technically required to get paid that, and you can't leave him off, or her. So, but no, that's great, and there are intricacies that people need to be aware of. So that's great. So, Jim, in your area of expertise, can you talk about some of the health and welfare kind of benefit options that are available to companies that are either getting ready to do DBA and they haven't yet done it, or they've been on DBA and maybe are looking for other options? Just love to get your ideas on that.
Sure. Well, if anybody follows our page on LinkedIn, we have like what we call a GovCon straight talking strategies thing that we're putting out, a couple times a week or every other week. But one of them was around DBA, and strategy for DBA is much different than SCA. SCA are typically very long cycle contracts, you're talking 3 to 5 years, whereas DBA could be anywhere from 3 months to 6 months to 2 years, depends if you're building a highway or a tunnel or whatever it is. And you have to plan your benefits and your health and welfare benefits accordingly, right? So you're not just going to go in and bid the job and say, it's time and materials and we can afford to lose X. You can't do that, right? Especially if you're an ALE, which is an applicable large employer. The benefits have to be in alignment because you're going to be regulated by ACA. You're going to have some folks that take, some folks that don't. You really have to understand your population for that contract. So that's first and foremost. You cannot plan it the way you would an SCA population. Secondly, going back to Eric's initial statement, the tracking of this is weekly. So if you use cash in lieu as a strategy, you have to make sure that those cash in lieu health and welfare dollars are on their next available check. That might be a lot of turnaround or too quick of a turnaround for a DBA company to register hours and then get on their next functional payroll. You really have to plan and strategize. But as far as the actual benefits themselves, they don't change, right? The larger companies, especially a Prime and any ALE, will want you to have benefits in place. They're going to want to reduce the amount of cash in lieu of benefits because there's two aspects of that. Once you set that in motion, it's a precedent for all of your other contracts, and kind of employees start making demands. And then the second thing is, did you build in the applicable taxes in the exposure to your workers' comp rate? They're going to affect your overhead. And if you're only getting paid in tranches or in draws under a DBA contract or performance-based, do you have the cash flow to manage those cash in lieu and then that quick turnaround? This all goes back to understanding, again, your project, the duration of that project, and the people that will be devoted to that project. And again, you can't take, executives that are running a backhoe and you can call them an executive, but if they're running a backhoe, you better be paying them, right? So, and tracking that and having a system that can do that. So the benefit options are far and wide. They range, again, based on the type of contract, the duration, whether you're a prime or sub. These are all strategy things. And you should have those conversations way before you start just throwing numbers at a proposal. Because if you win and you're wrong, you're eating a lot of that, misinformation, so to speak. It's going to come up as a loss on your ledger. So those are just things to be aware of when you're planning the benefits.
That's great. You mentioned cash in lieu, which is obviously also on SCA, where instead of the actual benefit being paid, say, to a provider, they're getting the cash instead as wages. Can you talk a little bit about one of the options I've seen and where you've seen pros and cons, where they don't do the cash in lieu, but they take the differential and say put it into a qualified 401k DBA plan, right? They can contribute the excess into their 401k plan.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a big thing for DBA clients right now. A lot of these contracts, the contractors are struggling to get bodies to perform them. So they feel the employees can make a lot of demand. We need the cash. We're not going to stay on the job unless we get the cash, those types of things.
Yeah.
You have to be conscious though, if you're an ALE, a applicable large employer over 50 people, you have to provide benefits. If that employee goes out in the private market and they take a plan and they're still getting health and welfare and you're dumping it all to retirement or cash, you're going to get hit with a penalty, right? So you have to understand that the strategy, and just dumping it all to retirement doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Especially, and let's just straight talk this, in the DBA world, people want their money, right? And they don't look at the retirement as possibly as advantageous as maybe somebody in the IT fields or maybe a retired veteran that's building up.
That's
just to
a great
build up
point.
a nest egg, right? So they're looking at this saying, great, you put it into my retirement, I'm going to turn that retirement account into an ATM. And they're just going to keep taking money out or whenever they can. It's not doing the company any good, and it sure as heck isn't helping the employees in a long-term strategy. So when you're approaching these contracts, you want to talk to people as they live. If you have benefit, here's how we supply the benefits as an employer. And if it's going to retirement, here's how that retirement account can be advantageous to you. If there is some cash, you want to have all this laid out when you're explaining to the employee, so they don't try to switch things up or make demands that could put you in an disadvantageous position on the contract.
No, that's really good information, because I've heard companies consultants try to push them to this. Oh, put it in the retirement plan. You can increase the amount of benefits. Your ADP testing, non-discrimination testing. You get more of a base, but like you said, the employees want that cash. So it's very important to balance that out.
Well, in DBA contracts too, again, you're talking about typically pretty large fringes per hour. It's a lot of money, right?
Yes, it is.
And you're going to max out a 401k contribution on a 6-month contract. What do you do then, right?
Yep.
And then you're starting to talk about, did we get back into the profitability of the contract? Were we delivered? Depends again on what type of contract or contract type. But if it's a performance-based and you finish early, great, you're making cash. But if it's time and materials and you're lagging, you could run into some problems, especially if those unexpected taxes are increased to your workers' comp, weren't forethought out things.
Yeah. Well, with regards to, and I know we talked about it kind of at the SCA perspective, but there's also, you mentioned self-funded versus partially funded health and welfare plans, SCA. Can you talk a little bit about it, how that works with DBA as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, do you want to start off with the legalities first, and then I'll get into the crack app of it?
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, DOL does not like self-funded plans. Essentially, you need to kind of there's an approval process in order to get a self-funded plan to count for the health and welfare benefit that's required under the wage determination. So, when thinking about bidding on a contract and options that are out there, the self-funded plans are not really favorably looked at. In fact, DOL gives a hard time about taking credit for payments under a self-funded plan because it's not sent to a third party irrevocably, which is what's required under the regulations, unless it's approved by DOL. So that's a sticky wicket that some contractors get into. They have these plans where if it's a claims paid plan, if somebody has it's a health plan where if somebody has a claim, they submit the claim and get paid. But that's something that will have to be approved in advance, and it's a lot more complicated than just doing a third-party administrator plan, because just to kind of calculate that all out and figure out how much somebody is owed versus somebody else, it just gets to be really complicated. So when thinking about kind of bidding on these contracts and how things are priced, I would price it out. I would look into a third-party plan and try to price that into the cost of your contract. The cost is going to be minimal aside from the cost of the benefits themselves for the most part, because historically, and this is in the guidance that DOL issued many years ago, the cost of administering those benefits by a third-party administrator is included in the H&W. Now, we've had some folks at DOL who have maybe taken some issue with that recently, but that's generally that's what the rules say. That's what the guidance says that DOL has issued. So, you still want to kind of account for all those costs because the margins are very thin in these DBA contracts. But, I think, that's probably the way to go at this point. Now I'll pass it over to Jim to put a bow on it.
So everybody got the legal opinion, right? Now here's the practical application of that data.
My legal opinions are very practical, I want to say.
Yes, but here's the day-to-day application of it, right, folks? So Eric's point is very well taken in that if you do not get approval of a trust and your plan, you're opening your nose up. Essentially, you're subjecting yourself to a lot of scrutiny, and the DOL does not like that. You have to unequivocally show that the funds that are going to premium and accounting for claims payment by employee are actually expended. If they're not, you cannot take those funds back as you would a traditional self-funded plan and put them into OpEx. They were paid for by health and welfare, and if the plan was approved, the DOL wants to see that the employee is getting their value from their health and welfare earned. So you absolutely should have a system that can track that by employee. Again, shameless self-plug, that's what Axe does. On the other hand, and we see it every single day. On the outset of that, if you go partially self-funded or self-funded like we talked about under SCA, it's self-funded. You need to have your plan reviewed. You need to have the trust associated with it reviewed. A lot of brokers in the space don't do this step, and it's not their fault. It's the fact that contractors move on very short timeframes. We were just notified. We were just told, if that's the case, self-funding or partially self-funding just because the rates look good is not a good idea for you if you don't get your plan reviewed and approved. If you just jam it down your broker's throat and tell them to put it in place for you, you're going to open yourself up to, again, a lot of issues and possibly a bad relationship with that broker and or carrier. So you want to make sure that you're doing the proper review first. That is drastically been exacerbated by COVID, by the way. So DOL is not reviewing plans in 2 to 3 weeks. Plan for more like 12 to 15. That's what reviews are taking right now from our end of our clients, getting reviewed and saying the trust is approved, the plan is approved. And you have to have an action plan of how those self-funded dollars are going to be tracked by employee. So when you submit that review plan, you obviously want to have your administrator submit that as well by employee.
And one thing I'll add as the auditor in the group, once you have a trust and you have over 100 participants in that, let's say health and welfare trust, that needs to get audited. So there's another cost there. There's a financial statement audit of that plan, as well as it checks compliance requirements. Are the funds being paid for valid claims and other benefits or expenses to the plan and not just general corporate operations. And that is very important. So just know that, and that's another cost that they can pass that through the plan, but it does require an audit. There could be additional 990 filing requirements. This depends on the type of trust as well as a 5500. It all depends. So there's a lot to consider when you're factoring these things in. So,
one thing, Pete, I didn't mention that I just wanted to also mention is that this applies to contracts in the 50 states plus DC, and contracts more than $2,000, which is just about every contract out there. But I meant to mention that earlier and I forgot, so I wanted to just throw that out there for the group.
yeah, that's great. That's great. Thanks for that. That's always good information, right?
Yes.
And so you mentioned a little bit about pricing, Eric, and either one of you can jump into this. So when you're pricing a DBA contract, what are some of the nuances and that you need to factor into? And whoever wants to tackle it, start it, and the other one can jump in as necessary.
I'll start and pass it off to Jim again. So, the first thing you want to, of course, do is make sure that this is a DavisBacon Act contract. It's not always easy to figure that out because you have projects where, the DC Center case that happened over the last number of years, it ended a year or two ago at this point, which was land that DC kind of gave over to developers to build a huge complex of buildings. And DC is covered by the DavisBacon Act, and there was a big litigation about whether DavisBacon Act was applicable or not. And you have these kind of nuanced things, but let's assume, for instance, for our purposes, that we know it's a DavisBacon Act contract. But just don't forget about that first step to try to figure out whether it's appropriate or not. Then you have to figure out, all right, who am I going to use for this project? Which categories of labor categories of individuals? What's the wage termination say about how much wages and benefits they're supposed to get? How many hours do I think? It's not an easy task, and the government oftentimes wants these things on a flat fee basis. So you have to be really careful with the pricing, and the pricing should take account, like I said, the right labor category, the right wages, and the right benefits. There's been too many times where folks on the front end didn't take care in pricing, and then on the back end they're paying for it because they're paying out back wages and benefits to workers, and that's not recoverable from the agency. If the agency has properly put in the clause in wage termination in the contract, and there's a mistake in how folks are mapped or manpower or something like that, unless something on the ground has changed, which does happen, the agency is not going to come and bail out the contractor. Unfortunately, as somebody who represents contractors, but that's just the reality of what happens. So, I think from a pricing perspective, you got to really look very carefully at the wage termination, and then just kind of figure out, task by task, who's going to do what and how much time it's going to take. So that way it could be figured out, how much they're going to be paid. And of course, there are subcontractors. A lot of prime contractor, contractors don't do a lot of the work. They pass it off to subs who have specialties in certain areas. And it's really important that those clauses and wage terminations are flowed down to those folks as well. And when they're flowed down to those folks, they understand what their requirements are. And you do minimize your risk a little bit by getting pricing, from subcontractors. Maybe you have a flat fee. You're going to bid $1 million to build a building. Obviously, it's probably going to be higher, but just for our sake of argument, and the prime contractor is going to do 20% of the work. So that 20% is what you really have to drill down and figure out, and then the rest is going to be subbed out. You get quotes from those subs, and it's up to them to kind of figure out how they're going to price it the right way and make it work. So that obviously minimizes the impact, but having those subs lined up and knowing what they're willing to bid is critical at the early stage. Too often I see it where this happens after the fact, and after the fact is way too late because you're probably going to lose money at that point.
Yep.
Yeah, I have seen that happen, especially if it's a new contractor that has no experience in DavisBacon. They want to get into that realm and they have no expertise, and they can lose a shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah, from a pricing standpoint on the benefit side too. Oh, sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Oh, just really quick. And there's just so many nuances too. Like, you have truck drivers on the site, and sometimes they're covered and sometimes they're not, depending on what they're doing. So kind of figuring out all those nuances along the way, is really important to kind of get that price right. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Nope. I was going to say, a lot of times you're using, day laborers, right? And things like that. They're still subjected to receive the health and welfare, but they might not be benefits eligible. You have to make sure you're pricing that in, and you're not just dumping them in and, overestimating, right? Or making sure they're going to work a certain amount of hours and they become benefits eligible. So along Eric's line of pricing, you want to look at all the factors of really how you're going to use people on this contract. And if you overestimate, you take yourself out of competitive range. If you underestimate, you lose money on the contract. So it truly is understanding the scope and delivery. That's hard when you're a sub. It's really hard because you might not get the full scope, right? You get your job and how many days you have or weeks you have to do it or months you have to do it, but you're not possibly getting full scope of really how many bodies it takes. Having clear lines of discussion with your prime. Don't just say, gosh, we got a contract. Great, let's go do our job. I know it's a quick turnaround, folks, but it's asking another 5 minutes worth of questions will probably save you tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on the job, right? So properly getting the scope down as far as bodies, aligning them to the wage determination that, like Eric said, the job being done, and then saying, are they benefits eligible or not? It can save you a whole lot of frustration on the back. And the difference between making money or losing money. We come across subs every day saying, man, we wish we would have talked to you guys earlier to really help us understand that. We'll know better for the next time. They already lost money. How many people have, UNICEF typed above their door, right? Like, you can't just keep taking it on the short end. You have to make money. And with COVID, we've seen everybody's pricing has changed, right? People are charging more. And a lot of companies that aren't charging more and they think they can stay competitive. The world has changed. People that want to get out on the job and do the work, the people you want to do the work are going to cost. So you have to make sure that you're paying in line with the wage determination and your benefits mix is enough to attract them, keep them on the job, and continue through to completion.
That's all great points. I'm sure anyone that's entered into a contract to have a new house built recently is realizing what's going on. Sticker shock as well as delays. And I'm sure that's prevalent in the commercial construction as well.
Pete, can I just mention one more thing on pricing?
Yeah.
Is that the classifications are a little bit more complicated under DavisBacon Act, because under SCA you have this Directory of Occupations, which sets out a national standard for what each person should do. There's not an equivalent in DavisBacon Act land, right? It's based on the locality, and then you get these amorphous arguments with folks about how much they should be paid based on what labor classification. And so kind of just being conservative, I think, on the front end is very helpful with that, because and understanding what the locality calls for obviously is as well. But I just wanted to point out that was a difference between SCA also in this area.
No, that's a great point. And like if it's a contract, as you mentioned, say DC or state, where it's a combination of federal and state monies, and are you complying with all of that? And what if the state's paying more or less and you think you're complying? It's all kinds of risks involved that you got to factor into. Jim, you're talking prime sub issues, or that arrangement and having communications. Either one of you, feel free to jump in. What are some common issues that do arise? And let's say the prime's getting audited, and then they ask, and the sub then gets audited as well. Prime's great, but there are issues that's uncovered at the sub. Is the prime responsible? Or is it just a sub? Can the prime protect itself if the sub screws up? I'd love to get your thoughts on that from either perspective.
Sure. Yes, the prime is responsible, unfortunately. That's why it's really important to figure out who you're going to dance with when you do these projects. So what generally happens, DOL actually historically has taken a practical approach to this, where they'll look, if the sub is not compliant with the DavisBacon Act, according to DOL, they'll look at the subcontract agreement between the prime and the sub, and they'll look to see, was this clause in wage termination flowed down to the subcontractors so they were made aware that DavisBacon Act applied? And if they look at the subcontract agreement, if DOL does, and they see everything's in there that's supposed to be in there, then DOL is going to probably first look to the sub to pay those back wages and maybe even take some further enforcement action against the subcontractor for failing to pay wages and benefits. If in fact the opposite is the same, well, let me just actually tease that out just a little bit further. But let's just say the subcontractor still refuses to pay, DOL still has the power to go to the prime and get those back wages, even though they were really subcontractor wages. The important point is that those subcontractors, those prime contractors, should really have clauses in their subcontract agreements that allows the prime to withhold payments if the sub is not complying with, with a back wage, finding from the Department of Labor. So you want to make sure that those subcontract agreements have those kind of triggers in them that allow the prime contractor to do withhold or to collect the money or whatever it is, however you want to structure it. In the instance where the prime fails to flow things down, then it just is a lot worse for the prime, where the investigation may focus on the subcontractor, but the DOL may come to the prime contractor first looking for those wages and benefits. It just depends on the situation. But if there are further penalties, such as a proposal for debarment, it could be that the prime is the one that's proposed for debarment if they fail to inform the subcontractor of DBA. It happens less frequently in DavisBacon Act construction contracts because of this weekly payroll requirement, certified payroll requirement. But it does happen. Maybe there's a subcontractor that the agency doesn't really know about who's working on the contract, is doing some labor work or something. So, it's the headline is, if whether you're a prime or a sub, you want to have confidence that the company you're doing business with on this federally funded construction project is a company that you can trust. Because if it's not, you're probably going to run into issues like this.
Yeah, definitely open yourself up to risks. Jim, anything from your standpoint that you've seen or that you've even done to help in those situations?
Yep. I mean, unfortunately, we've been brought into it recently, especially in the DBA world, by a lot of primes saying we have an issue, right? At that point, it's too late. It's already been identified as an issue. And unfortunately, payments have lagged, especially in the DBA space. There's been some subs that weren't financially able to complete the contract, and they did not abide by the rules, and now they're out. Well, if they fold up shop and there's no money to go after, the government's now just saying, like Eric said, well, you're the prime and you don't have the appropriate agreements in place to protect yourself or possibly have that sub, be the responsible party. The other thing we have a lot of subcontractors that come to us and they candidly don't know how to report this stuff. Like Eric said earlier, they're new. They might not be aware of the requirements for certified payrolls. And you have to have a payroll partner that understands certified payroll. You have to have somebody in-house that can make sure that they happen in time. And if there's anything like a cash in lieu and the sub saying, yeah, we have to give cash because that's what the prime's doing. Okay, did you put it into your pricing, right? Or is it going to run you out? And do you understand what that means in turning it around to payments? A lot of companies don't realize that they have to get those cash payments in the next available check. Yep. And now they're 2-3 payrolls behind and they owe these employees quite a bit. And then they get their nose opened up and, they're not too happy with the results because the prime didn't know that they were not paying them in lockstep and the sub didn't have the money to catch up. So somebody has to pay and the government's going to find who can pay fastest and first and get it done.
Yep. That's the pitfalls or the things you got to worry about when you're prime, for sure. And if you're a sub and not familiar with DBA, you can definitely get caught, and lose a lot of money. And like I said, be put under. There's always issues, but there's also opportunities. I mean, when you get approached, what are some things you do proactively, Jim? Hopefully people are coming to you up front. Let's say they're a sub and want to get on a DBA contract with a prime. Is there any special advice you try to give them?
Absolutely. So we always ask them, like, what job are they doing, right? Well, what are you doing in this contract? Has the prime told you what your function is going to be, first and foremost? Has that all been negotiated? And do you have the recruiting capabilities to get that even completed? You have the people in-house that you're moving from one contract to another. And then you say, is this truly a DavisBacon? To Eric's one main point, is this truly a DavisBacon Act contract? Because DavisBacon Act applies to new construction, typically. So anything you're building, roads, highways, buildings, hospitals, whatever, that's going to be DavisBacon. It's going to be pretty clearly defined.
Yeah.
But if you have something that's like rehab work and it says DavisBacon, it could actually be Service Contract Act, and the prime doesn't know, because what they're doing on the contract is DavisBacon work, and maybe you're doing a refurb or a repaint or something like that. That's not part of that contract. It's actually Service Contract Act work.
Yeah.
And then you have a whole different scale of health and welfare dollars that you have to abide by. So you have to ask a lot of questions up front, and you have to make sure that you're doing the right contract. And it literally takes 20 to 30 minutes of asking questions. We do this diagnoses with clients all the time. If you win a contract, great. Let's make sure that you're doing it right up front, and you're going to make money from it. You're going to provide the best benefits. And then, are you doing the right work under the contract, right? Has it been clearly defined? Because primes, they win awards too, and they say, we need somebody to do this work. We don't want it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Did they properly flow down the right part of the contract and give you all the information? So asking 20 to 30 minutes of questions can probably save you a lot of heartache.
Yeah. Was they poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part.
Yeah.
If they plan it right and do the upfront work, it's going to save a lot of headaches, especially in this area. It's true of anything, but truly in this area, it's immeasurable.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about something that's been in the news, this new infrastructure legislation, the one that was passed. Probably not worth talking about the one that might be passed. What are some of the potential changes with DavisBacon Act that's in this infrastructure? And I'll go to the attorney first. Eric?
I mean, it was really interesting. You've seen different iterations of this, and it still has to be, passed by both houses. So there's still, the language could change a little bit. But the language that, as it's written, says that folks who are working on contracts that are using money from this package have to be paid wages and benefits in accordance with the DavisBacon Act. And it's a little bit of a nuance where it's not compliance with the DavisBacon Act. So you could argue that maybe the certified payroll is not required and some things like that, but that they have to use the wage determinations for that area where the construction project is being done. If it stays like that, we'll see in the end. And
it's one of those ones like ACA, we'll find out what's in it after it's passed.
Right. And and how DOL interprets that will be interesting to see too. Will DOL say, well, this just means it's DavisBacon Act, or will there be a more nuanced approach? We all know how DOL loves to take nuanced approaches, but will be more of a nuanced approach where it's they say, all right, it's just the wages and benefits here in this wage determination. That's it. And what kind of I'm not clear yet on what kind of investigation power DOL will have for wage violations on these projects, because you could conceivably have projects on this infrastructure bill that are not DavisBacon Act projects, but are projects that are have some federal money involved from the source, at least as it moves down the line. So that'll be interesting to see. And then of course we have the $15 minimum wage, which is applicable to the DavisBacon Act workers too. But I'll pass off the infrastructure to Jim if he has any comments. I don't know if he does or not. Otherwise, we can pick up $15.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the budget is, and the analyses are that there's going to be a lot more money coming down for a lot bigger contracts, right? So if you're going after these, do you know how to properly bid them? Do you know how to source them? And can you complete the work, right? Just don't go after big contracts. And if you're going to be a sub to a large prime, make sure that you're very clear on the jobs that you'll be doing, right? Your cost are your cost. And that's what you have to go into. A lot of people try to pinch pennies to get into a contract, or they try to underestimate it. And then they get to the job and they realize, oh, wow, my employees won't take benefits. I need to provide cash in order to keep people doing the work. There's a cost overrun of 25, 30% of the health and welfare dollars, right? So you have to be very clear on what you're bidding, because there's going to be a lot of money coming out, a ton of money coming out for folks, which I believe will benefit a lot of people and it'll put a lot more people back to work on very big long-term contracts. Those fringes, again, as to Eric's earlier point, are by state. Some of them could be really large. Employees are going to have potential to have a lot more money than they've ever had. And if you're not supplying benefits to eat into some of that, all cash is very much going to be a problem, because they're going to take a lot of small companies and make them ALEs quickly for some of these contracts. There'll be over 50 employees, they'll be subjected to ACA, and you're going to have benefits ready and prove that the dollars went to benefits when the DOL comes knocking.
That's great information. So we did get a question. Even if we are a sub and are not working on the construction aspect of the project, do we still have to follow DavisBacon Act? And I'll turn that over to Eric. Eric, is this going to be an it depends?
Probably, but you're probably not going to be covered by DavisBacon Act. Even in the guidance that DOL issues, they are very clear to say like why certain truckers are covered and why certain ones are not. If you're just delivering things to the work site, you're probably not covered. But if you're doing trucking on the work site, you are. And material providers are not going to be covered probably by DavisBacon Act. So I'd say it depends, but it's probably, if you're not working on the construction aspect, you're probably not going to be covered, but it's important to kind of look at it carefully because their stakes are too high. Spend an hour or two and looking at and analyzing it and making sure, but probably not covered at that point.
I'll give you a quick answer to that, Eric, how that works. If you're doing engineering work on the construction site or you're doing, laser shooting for boundary lines and things like that, they're probably not covered under the DBA, right? Because engineers, and because of the incomes and things like that, will probably be out of scope. You want to make sure that the job that you're specifically doing is not applicable. You're going to find if you're driving a truck onto the site and you're waiting for loads to be delivered, you're probably going to be counted for that specific type of work. But if you're an engineer going on and doing site inspection and things like that, most of the time those are excluded. So you want to make sure that the work being done is accurate.
I think Jim brings up a good larger point, which we haven't really talked about this time. What we talked about the last one is kind of seeing if people are exempt or not. That's the first, once you, as you're pricing something out, seeing if there's an exemption. And it's a two-part test, of course. There's the how much they're being paid and the duties test, and you have to meet both tests in order to be exempt. So that's obviously part of the pricing, and it's part of figuring out if people are covered or not by the DavisBacon Act.
Yeah, just to remind people that both these acts, the McNamara-O'Hare Service Contract Act, or SCA, and the DavisBacon Act, they were implemented to basically raise wages and make sure the laborers, the people, not the highly technical or professional people, because they are getting highly paid. It's those day laborers, the lower echelon, that they're getting what they consider a fair wage. They're getting benefits. So basically federal dollars should be spent in those ways. So just to reiterate, what the person's doing, what category they're in, not their title. It's really about the work that they're performing. And you really got to be understanding, is it part of the construction project itself, or is it something else that's not? And I think understanding your contract terms is extremely important, and having those conversations with your prime, as Jim suggested, is extremely important. See, something else came up. So talk about being proactive, but to what extent? Should every firm over a certain revenue threshold have an SCA and/or DBA expert on their HR staff and consistently included or considered in their bidding processes? I don't know about on staff. Again, I think this comes down to how big a company are you? Do you outsource everything other than the laborers? Or do you have an internal HR person that's expert? I think it depends on the size of the company, but definitely having access to experts like Jim, like Eric, like myself, others that are in this realm is extremely important. And, just an hour conversation with Jim, I bet will be priced or Eric.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I
at the
think-
end of the day, this is why we do what we do, right? So Eric, obviously being a lawyer and faces this all the time, can talk about the practical application when it comes down to being audited and at pricing and all that, but he's not in the line of answering HR questions, right? And then
Exactly.
Although I do sometimes.
yeah,
Right.
unfortunately,
So there's
actually sometimes.
outsourced HR people that do
Yeah.
this work. There are many people that do this. And so having internal may not make sense depending on how big they are. If they
Very
are big
expensive.
enough and they're on this work, they absolutely should have an internal.
Yep, and again, it's very expensive to have somebody internal because most of the time, that internal person, and I'm speaking to the brokers and consultants on this call, and contractors, they're going to turn to somebody that does the practical application, daily compliance, in interactions with DOL anyway. Not knocking HR folks and everything, but they can only know so much. So I'll give you a quick example. What Axe Inference Solutions does, no HR company is going to match, because they can't match that. I have a whole company of people doing that job. They're not going to match the speed, the scope, or the delivery, right? No HR person is going to be able to dig into a legal contract and have Eric's knowledge. They just can't replicate what his years of service has done. So having a phone conversation or typing a question costs you nothing. What it does, though, is it gets you in the right hands of which road to go down properly or better. And then when you need to bring in that consultant, that lawyer, that team or whatever, it's turn on the dime. You know you're getting the person that can help accelerate you faster. That's really why the GovCon board has us around, and that's what we're brought together to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just in HR or other areas. And I'll say on the DavisBacon Act, that weekly reporting requirement can be extremely time consuming. I know I've audited companies, I've assisted companies with that. It's a lot of spreadsheet data, and you better hope you don't have formula errors. There are some systems that larger ERPs that have built in, but even you got to be careful, just like GeiGo, garbage in, garbage out. If they're not set up right, there could be issues. And you need accountants as well who understand how to pull in the payroll data, calculate this fringe, and make sure it's accurate. It's not an easy process. So just having the experts around, either internal or external, you definitely need those.
You get a lot of covered information on LinkedIn, by the way. Between the three of us, we put a lot of information out, folks, and this is no cost, right? So when there are those questions, start with the resources you don't have to pay for, and then work your way into what's going to cost you, right?
Exactly.
But, LinkedIn, we have a lot of information.
As much as it hurts me to agree with you, I agree with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Just one thing I kind of brought up really quickly, but I know we're running out of time, is the $15 minimum wage executive order that came out.
Yeah.
DOL issued a proposed regs on it. Final regs from DOL are due by the end of the year. We're waiting for the FAR Council to issue their proposed regs or final regs on it. Maybe they'll do a final interim rule. That's been their MO recently. So that's going to require workers who are working on these contracts, if the clause is in your contract, to make no less than $15 an hour, and it includes those in connection with workers too. So they don't have to be necessarily covered by the DavisBacon Act. They have to be supporting a DavisBacon Act contract. Perhaps like the security guard that watches a construction site, after hours, or the person who's, generating invoices to the government. They're spending at least 20% of their time doing that kind of work. They'll be covered too.
It's got broad reach. Well, we are coming up to the hour. I don't see any open questions unless someone has anything pressing they want to ask. I just we can wrap this up. And again, I'd like to thank Fedmine for hosting. And again, Jim and Eric doing an excellent job as always, providing great information. And the GovCon board, again, thank you all for supporting this, and we look forward to future events. The sponsor, or listen to the slide deck. What's that?
And our next one is on investigations.
Yes.
For
And would be
September 8th.
Yeah, September 8th, shortly after Labor Day. So that's going to be a very, very good one as well.
Yeah.
dealing with investigations which are going on. And the last thing you want to be if your company's investigated is unprepared. So, but again, thank you, everyone. Take care and see you next time.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Pete.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks,
You.
Arkisha.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.